نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم، رسوله النبي الأمين المكين الحنين الكريم رؤوف الرحيم. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. وقال تعالى أيضا فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن. صدق الله المولانا العظيم وبلغنا رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك لمن الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله والحمد لله والحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا رسول الله، الصلاة والسلام عليك يا حبيب الله. Most respected ulama, my respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praise is due to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the benedictions of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, that Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite generosity and bounty has facilitated for us without any effort on our part to gather for Jumu'ah. May Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it beneficial for all of us and accept what we do sincerely for His sake, inshallah. A question that is very commonly asked because of things people see, because of things people encounter, and sometimes, often, things that don't make sense according to standards that we think we understand is, and this is my topic for today, inshallah, why do bad things happen to good people? Very often you'll see a situation and it doesn't seem to make sense. Why is this happening? Can't it happen any other way? And to some extent, it's also difficult to understand why do good things happen to bad people. People that you can see the person is not a good person, but things seem to be going very well for them. And this can be on a macro scale, for example, global politics. You can look at things that are happening in Gaza, for example. In that context, it becomes difficult to understand. And on an individual level as well, people often ask, I try my best, man. I make my salah, I go above and beyond, I do tahajjud, this and that and the other, but things don't seem, something bad is always happening to me. And this is something personal to me. This particular question I struggled with for a long time, because we generally see quite a lot of suffering, and particularly during my rotation at Red Cross Hospital, where we saw a lot of things happening to children, and this became very difficult for me. So this topic is something personal to me and something I struggled with for a long time as well. And inshallah, I hope that these answers can give you solace the way they gave me solace, inshallah. It's not a topic that hasn't been discussed here before. I have discussed it in a different context. Hafiz Fuzail has touched on it as well. I've discussed in the past 17's benefits of tribulations from Sultan al-Ulama Izzuddin ibn Abdul Salam al-Sulami rahimahullah ta'ala. But today's context and today's viewpoint and angle you'll find to be a bit different and refreshing. And it's based on a text that's entitled Al-Insan wa Adalatullahi fil Ard, Man and Allah's Justice on Earth, by Sheikh Dr. Professor Saeed Ramadan Al-Buti rahimahullah ta'ala. And he proposes to answer quite a few questions. The obvious one that people ask is, I do good things, but why are bad things happening to me? That person does bad things, why are good things happening to them? Okay, we know the 17 benefits of tribulation, but why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us these benefits without the tribulation? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to give us a benefit, why didn't He give us the benefit without having to go through the suffering, in our own terms? And what is the secret, or what are some of the reasons why people don't suffer equally? You'll find different people have tribulations, others don't. People have a different extent. Some people are going through worse things, but there doesn't seem to be a way that we can make sense. What's the law behind all of these things? And most importantly for me and for you today, inshallah, is why these doubts occur in the first place. And one of the things I find very refreshing and I appreciate about this author, rahimahullah ta'ala, across the thread of his discussions, is that he really gets to the core and the root of certain things. Now, what is the fundamental thing that we need to address here in order to answer this question? And I really love that about him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him and raise his maqam in the akhirah, inshallah. So these doubts occur to fundamentally three groups of people. The first group of people is the innocent bystander, does what he needs to do on a day-to-day basis, believes in Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in the last day, doesn't have any doubts, but he can't answer these questions. So somebody will ask him, okay, you're a believer, you believe in God, you believe in scripture and His messengers and all of that. How do you explain this, that and the other? And he doesn't have an answer. So that's the first category of person, doesn't have any doubts, believes but doesn't have any answers either. The second category of people, which is the majority of people, is people who have iman. They declare faith, but their faith was not strong enough to withstand certain assaults that weaken or shake their faith when these things happen. For example, meeting someone that casts doubt into their mind. And so that person not only not has any answers, but he begins to doubt his own faith when somebody asks him, how do you explain these things? Or it may be that that person has their own psychological issues, problems that they have mentally because of extremism and so forth. Or it may be that they've undergone some shock, some tribulation, something massive has happened to them, some great loss, some disease, some terminal diagnosis, they've lost a family member, etc. And they can't come to terms with it. Or there's some worldly temptation that they can't access without crossing that barrier and compromising their faith. Such as a person, for example, that they want to be with, who says, you can't be with me until you give up your faith or compromise your beliefs, or you're going to have to believe this thing my way, or try to attain some form of dunya. These are some of the reasons why people's faith is shaken, because they can't reconcile what is happening and what they believe. And this discussion will be most beneficial for that group of people. The third group of people, and I find great wisdom in this, is the Shaykh says, people, we need to identify whether the person putting forth this argument is in the category of people who's a professional spreader of deceit and a person who's propagating these ideas of disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the last day and justice. And if the person makes this his occupation, if they're firmly rooted in that belief and they go about spreading these things, spreading confusion in the minds of people, then these people will not benefit from any form of discussion, debate and explanation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, speaking about this category of people in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَلَوْ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَابًا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ فَظَلُّوا فِيهِ يَعْرُجُونَ لَقَالُوا إِنَّمَا سُكِّرَتْ أَبْصَارُنَا بَلْ نَحْنُ قَوْمٌ مَسْحُورُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, for this category of people, even if we opened the heavens and you found that these people would be now rising up into the heavens, they would say, لَقَالُوا إِنَّمَا سُكِّرَتْ أَبْصَارُنَا. They would say, it is just that our eyes have become bewitched and that we have been cast some kind of spell so that we think that this is happening. They'll never accept anything. So I encourage you and myself not to waste your time debating or trying to convince this category of people. And it takes a degree of wisdom which the Shaykh is putting forth to be able to diagnose that and deal with it appropriately. So in order to understand now what is tribulation, before we can understand where it occurs and why it occurs, the definition of tribulation, I found after going through this discussion that the author puts forth, is something we often misunderstand. We often misunderstand tribulation or a trial as someone who's lost something in one form or the other, whether it's a belonging, whether it's a family member, whether it's their health, whether it's some kind of disease. They've lost something and therefore they are undergoing pain and suffering as a result of that loss. And we often misunderstand well-being on the flip side of that to a person who has everything is going well for them, and they're walking around with a smile. The person may have a spring in their step and everything is going well for that person. He hasn't lost anything. So surely, from what you can see, that person is in a state of well-being. Conversely, we assume wrongly, listen to this very carefully, we wrongly assume that every person that's lost something, for example, a person's lost their eyesight, Allah protect everyone, or been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, for example, we automatically assume that that person is undergoing pain and suffering as a result of that. Not necessarily. And we automatically assume that a person who everything is going well for them, they have everything, they have a spring in their step, they're walking around, smiling, we automatically assume that that person is happy in their heart and totally content with everything, and that's not necessarily true. You may have a person who's lost everything. He's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He's got a few weeks to live. Nothing in the world matters to him anymore. And you may visit him and you may think, what a difficulty this person is going through, what a trial, how much of suffering, why is God doing this to this person? Yet, that actually might be a false assumption. That person in their heart may be completely content, they may be completely at peace with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they may have submitted to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that person may be more at peace and content and happy than the other person who everything seems to be going well for them, they have a spring in their step, they're smiling, walking around, yet in their heart, they may be torn about some tribulation that you don't know about. Maybe the object of their love they couldn't attain. Or some people, they may be multi-billion dollar businesses, but they may be under pain and anguish for some business deal that they lost. Or they may have some condition, something that's worrying them, something that's upsetting them, some debt or something. You don't know the condition of that person's heart. It's not to say that tribulations are illusory, that tribulations don't mean anything, that pain doesn't mean anything, the trials it's not that. But the idea being put across is that a person's outward condition doesn't necessarily translate to what we assume is going on in their heart. That there may be a person that outwardly appears a certain way, and we falsely assume that they are undergoing suffering as a result of that and pain, and we question the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on that false assumption. So that was something very interesting. Addressing this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this wrong idea, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, فَأَمَّا الْإِنسَانُ إِذَا مَبْتَلَاهُ رَبُّهُ فَأَكْرَمَهُ وَنَعَّمَهُ فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَكْرَمَنِ. And as for man, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala إِذَا مَبْتَلَاهُ رَبُّهُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tries him. It's a trial, it's a tribulation. But what is this tribulation? Oh wait, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, فَأَكْرَمَهُ وَنَعَّمَهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him what we consider to be bounties and blessings of the dunya. He says, فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَكْرَمَنِ. He wrongly says, my Lord has honored me. Not necessarily. So you may say, okay, fine. So we understand a person who's undergoing pain and suffering, he's got a trial. A person who looks happy but he's suffering in his heart, he's got a trial. But what about the person things seem to be going well for him, and in his heart he's really happy? How can that person be suffering? What's that person's trial? Now the reason we ask this question is because we often misunderstand another thing, which is shukr and gratitude. Okay? So obviously the person who's undergoing a trial and feels pain in his heart, his lot is sabr. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him is sabr, patience, meaning happily submitting to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not objecting to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if anyone's given a choice, they'll say, no, give me the other one. Give me, I'll take the trial of shukr, no problem, I'll do that one. Give me the wealth, give me everything of dunya, and I'll accept that. If shukr is a trial, give me that one. It's because we don't understand what shukr is. Shukr is not just what we say by our tongue, shukr Allah, shukr Allah, shukr Allah, thank you, Allahumma ma'asma min ni'matin. It's not that we just verbally express shukr or even feel shukr in our heart, what we understand to be gratitude in our heart. It's not enough. What shukr really implies, based on the bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, if we in that category of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants gratitude from us, is to use those bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us purely and completely and solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? Practically, it means whatever that bounty is, we generally tend to think of wealth, okay? But it's any bounty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, whether it's our eyesight, whether it's our health, whether it's free time, whatever blessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, what He wants from us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not just say, shukr Allah, thank you so much, God, Allah, shukr Allah. It's not that. But it's to take that and not disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with it first thing. So not to use anything, whether it's wealth, whether it's our health, whether it's our free time, in the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but even that's not enough. What we then need to do is take that and use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So expend our free time in the path of Allah. Expend our health in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Expend our wealth in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That then is complete shukr. So now, you may have one person who's poor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't give him any wealth. He's undergoing abject poverty. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him to have sabr. So he submits to the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doesn't complain, and he's happy with his lot in life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him that. But the person, take that very same person and tell him, okay, come. We're going to give you 100 million rand. And what you're going to do, sir, this is an entrustment for you. You have to administer that trust faithfully because we're giving you that trust. Use your basic needs from there, no problem. Eat and drink, take a salary, have your daily provisions, but don't go beyond that. And everything you have to do with this entrustment now is to serve the community or as a waqf or discharge his obligation in this way or the other. Come to him in a year and he's done that. The man, you can see, is basically just fulfilling his basic needs from that entrustment. That 100 million hasn't been touched to fulfill his own desires, his own ambitions. He hasn't overdone it. He hasn't overstepped the mark at all. And he's fulfilled that trust completely despite the temptation. That's the critical thing here. Despite the temptation. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. Very, very few of my servants you will find fulfilling the requirement of shukr. Taking the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is given us, and despite being able to do so, despite having the capacity to do so, not overdoing it. Only using those bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us for His sake. So that person has a higher rank because he does it willingly, voluntarily. Whereas the poor person, the person who has poverty, he got no choice. He has shukr, he has sabr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it benefits him psychologically and in the akhirah. But he is compelled. Whereas the person who has shukr, using that bounty for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he does that despite the temptation and the ability to overdo it with whatever bounty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him. That's why now you see, each person is in a trial. Whether the person has nothing and he makes sabr, or the person has everything and he makes shukr, because that shukr has to be practical in not using that bounty in other than what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you will understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَنَبْلُوكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. We try you with good and with difficulty as a tribulation. Good is a tribulation because you have to resist the temptation to use it for your desires, and difficulty is also a trial because it's hard and it causes pain. Alright? So that's one fundamental thing to understand, that whether we are supposed to make sabr or whether we are supposed to make shukr, both are a trial and tribulation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we still can't understand, okay, so everybody's in a trial. Each person has either shukr or sabr, which they have to do. Each person is either in plenty or in difficulty outwardly, and they have an obligation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But on what basis does this tribulation vary? How come this person is in that condition and the other person is in the other condition? How do we wrap our minds around that? Why can't we have a situation where nobody suffers? Okay, we have 17 benefits of tribulation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why didn't He give us all this without the tribulation? Well, we've got to then break it down again. A blessing is meaningless without its opposite. Wealth will mean nothing to us if we didn't have poverty. Health is meaningless without illness. I'll give you one example of this medically. Keratoconjunctivitis sicca. It's a condition where your eyes don't produce enough tears. I've used this example before because it's something we'll take for granted. Your eyes don't produce enough tears. Millions of people suffer from this. So what they've got to do, they've got to have eye drops in their pocket, and every now and again when the eyes start to grate, they've got to open their eyes and put eye drops in there. Our bounty of tears is completely meaningless. Nobody's like, yeah, shukr Allah, alhamdulillah for the tears you put in. Why? Because the opposite doesn't exist in front of us. We don't see that opposite. Therefore, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had just made everybody in a state of health and wealth and plentiful and ease and comfort and all of that, we would all be bored out of our minds. And there would be no bounty, nothing to be grateful for, because the opposite doesn't make you appreciate what we have. So the opposite has to exist for anything to be meaningful. Arrogance has to exist for humility to be meaningful. Otherwise, humility means nothing in and of itself. Okay, that's a basic principle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as His right as our creator, chose and willed out of His infinite wisdom that we can't understand to create man as His Khalifa, as His vicegerent on earth in a position of accountability. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as His khulafa on earth. And our sense of accountability and answerability before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which angels don't have, which mountains don't have, which animals don't have, other creations don't have the sense of accountability. This sense of accountability to fulfill our khilafah, to fulfill our role as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's greatest and most noble creation on earth would be meaningless without accountability, and accountability would be meaningless without difficulty. Right? As my teacher Maulana Abdul Rauf used to say, there's no Olympic gold medal for a 1 meter high jump. You've got to do something in order to be worthy of that reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a sense of accountability for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill our role as khilafah, which He willed in His wisdom. Now there's an important point. So you may ask, okay, well, why does it have to be that way? We could carry on until doomsday asking, well, why did it have to be that way? Well, why did it have to be that way? Well, why did it have to be that way? And at that point, we've got to go back to the fundamental premise. What's the fundamental premise? That the entire universe has a creator, that creator is all wise, and that His order that has been created, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is based on a wise design that we can't necessarily understand. And if we're always asking, why did He do that? Why did He do that? Why did He do that? Then we have to ask ourselves, do we really truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's overarching wisdom such that that belief has its implications in our behavior? And secondly, from a logical point of view, if you are saying, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do that? It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needs something to compel Him. We are creation. We need something to compel us to do something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as creator is free from the need of something compelling Him to do something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need a reason to do something. So the reason, we can ask, what is the wisdom? We can ask, what is Allah subhanahu, I would love to know what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hikmah in this, so that I can appreciate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more. But we're asking from a point to criticize, and that has to do with your niyyah. That becomes problematic. So that's why we can't have what some people understand as utopian society where everything is well, because there's a hikmah behind that, and I've spoken a little bit about that. And so what determines then, if everybody's in a trial, what determines the different trials that people go through? Why does one person suffer from loss of wealth, and another person a loss of health, another person a loss of a loved one, another person A, B, and C, debt, etc.? Why do different people suffer from different trials? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as our Rabb, as our nurturer and our nourisher and our sustainer, knows based on our internal reality what the state of our internal condition is, what we need for our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be consolidated and rectified. He knows that based on our internal state. It doesn't have to do with what appears and what's on the outside. It's based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, and what He knows is best for us, regardless of how we feel about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, عَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, it may be that there is something that you love which is bad for you, and there may be something which you hate which is good for you, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and you do not know. So it's based again on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's overarching wisdom. What He knows is best for us, that a certain person may get a trial of poverty, a certain person may get a trial of wealth, a certain person may get a trial of loss of health, etc. It's all based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best for us. And so you'll see a person may spend the first half of his life, everything is going well for them, they look happy, but they're in a state of heedlessness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then something happens to them. And then their life outwardly appears to be more difficult, but internally they're in such a state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result of that, that people have said, I would rather that this condition not be removed from me, rather than lose this relationship that I have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result of this condition. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, based on what He knows better about us. Okay, so you may ask, but what about the anomalies then? I can think of people whose condition doesn't fit this pattern. There's a person who's in the masjid 5 times a day. This person is making salah, he makes his tahajjud, he's the first person to enter the mosque, last person to leave, yet he's undergoing this heinous tribulation that I can't wrap my mind around. Or there's this person here who does this, he's taken that person for a ride, he does this sin, he's a habitual sinner, he's like this and like that, yet everything is going well for him. This law is not immutable. I can think of exceptions. No. The exceptions, the law is immutable. It's not based on what we can see, and each person's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not necessarily based on what we can see. It's not necessary that the person who is the first in the mosque and the last person to leave, who does the tahajjud and does all the nawafil fasting and all of that, has a link with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his eyes, is closer to Allah subhanahu, is more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the person who's a habitual sinner. I'll give you an example. Nu'ayman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and this incident is narrated by no less an authority than Imam Bukhari, among others. Nu'ayman radiallahu ta'ala anhu his habit was to make Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam smile. He was a prankster. He was a very playful character, Sahabi radiallahu anhu. But his habit was that he used to engage in alcohol. So he was found drunk quite a lot of times. And one time, when he was brought into the presence of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his punishment was to be flogged, one of the Sahaba ridwanullahi majma'in, look at now, a person outwardly, we think he's a goner. But one of the Sahaba also thinking this based on the outward, thinking he doesn't have any link with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of what he's doing, he says, curse him. He has to come here so many times for this. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stopped him. He said, do not curse him, for I know of him that he loves Allah and his Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nu'ayman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, look, this is very encouraging. So it doesn't mean that the person who does what we can outwardly see as a lot of extra ibadah, that he's closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the person who we can see is a habitual sinner. Maybe he's more beloved in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of his attitude, because of his humility with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe our own attitude of casting aspersion on people and judging them is more detestable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than what that person is doing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So in dealing with tribulations, we only have two options. One is not possible, because one is to block it out completely so that the tribulation, whatever is happening, doesn't affect you at all. It doesn't have any psychological effect on you, and that ability Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't given us. That ability only the insane people have, and that's why they are marful qalam, they are not accountable. Only those people have that ability that whatever happens doesn't affect them. But people who are sane have only one outlet. And that route is to consolidate and solidify our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our belief that, and this has to be something individual, not because the madrasa Abba told us, not because our parents told us, not because this is what we learned and what we were taught and this is what we know, but we have to be convinced individually, and we have to do whatever that takes, looking at the signs of Allah, becoming convinced that if there's such a marvelous creation that's in perfect order and synchrony, that there must be a creator who created, and we must be convinced of that individually. Once you're convinced of that individually, and we accept then that if there's a creator, then he must have given us guidance, then our worldview and our self-view and the paradigm with which we view ourselves and creation and our relationship with that creation has to be in accordance with what that creator has told us. And what has he told us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That our role, our fundamental identity, our core role is as slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Slaves, completely. We are completely bound and subjugated to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, and we have no option and no say in the matter. We cannot control, it's a pity, I've only gotten through half of this discussion, the time is up. We cannot control what happens to us. But what we can control is how we respond to it, how we react to it, and what our state is as a result of what happens to us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, ما أصاب من مصيبة في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها إن ذلك على الله يسير لكي لا تأسوا على ما فاتكم ولا تفرحوا بما آتاكم. Nothing befalls you, ما أصاب من مصيبة, of any difficulty, في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم, whether it's in the earth or whether it's in yourself, meaning health. إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها, except that it has been recorded in a book before it happens. Indeed, this is easy for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we can't control that part, right? But the other part we can control. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us this? لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسُوا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ, so that we are not grieved, we are not hurt, we are not despondent over that which happens to us, over that which misses us, that which we didn't get that. وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا آتَاكُمْ, but we're also not overly joyous and proud over what happens to us. Everything is a trial, everything is decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll give you a one last anecdote and conclude with this inshallah. And this is also, it's narrated by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim and in the Musnad of Ahmad bin Hanbal and at-Tayalisi as well. And this is what occurred with the Sahabi Abu Talha radiallahu ta'ala anhu. I like this because it brings everything together. And you can really see the implications of this understanding and how they applied it and how we can apply it. Abu Talha radiallahu ta'ala anhu was married to a very virtuous woman by the name of Sulaym bint Milhan radiallahu ta'ala anha. And they had a child, and this child was there was the only child, and the child was very beloved to them. Abu Talha was very attached to his child, and the child got sick. And he was very distressed on account of the illness of the child, and he was worried and he was anxious. But he used to spend the whole morning in the company of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he used to come home, and then in the afternoon he used to do his business, whatever it is. So he wasn't at home quite a lot of the times. While he was away, the child passed away. So Sulaym bint Milhan radiallahu anha, look how she handled the situation. She decided, okay, here's what I'm going to do. She bathed the child, shrouded him, and kept his body aside in the corner of the house. And told everybody in the house, nobody is to tell Abu Talha what happened to the child until I tell him. Abu Talha comes home, and he's obviously worried about the child. So he asked her, what happened to the child? She said, he's at peace. So he assumed now the child has gotten better. So he was happy and he was fine, and he ate, and she adorned herself very beautifully, and she lay down with him. And when this was concluded, she said, and this is the take-home message here, how she looked at her relationship with the child. She said to Abu Talha, she said, what would you say if I said to you that the neighbors lent us something, and now, after 10 years, they want it back? Do we have any right to withhold that from them and not give it back to them? He said, no, of course not. It's been 10 years, it's overdue. We must give it back to them. It belongs to them afterwards. Then she told him, then verily your child has passed away. So seek your reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be patient. After all that. But look how she viewed her relationship with the child. That everything, this is why the sunnah of reassuring someone, of giving someone ta'ziyah when they sustain a loss. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to console someone by saying, Lillahi ma akhad, wa lillahi ma a'ta. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what he takes, and belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whatever he gives. This is the implication of when we say, Inna lillah. We are slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have no control over what happens to us. Wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And when we return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the whole picture will unfold. Then the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be meted out on the day of Qiyamah. Then we'll see the entire picture, and then everything will make sense. We can't just look at the dunya, the small square of a big painting, and say, this just looks like random squiggles here, but this doesn't make any sense to me. Of course it doesn't make sense to us, because we're only looking at one section of the painting. The whole painting will unfold when? Inna ilayhi raji'un, when we return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of Qiyamah, and everything will make sense to us, inshallah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us all the tawfiq and hidayah, to understand things in their proper context, to understand our role in the proper context. And this book, by the way, has been translated by Mahdi Locke, and the title of the book is Man and Allah's Justice on Earth. It's a very beautiful English translation. I encourage all of you to take this and read it slowly. If you, like me, also had a bit of trouble with this. It's something we commonly ask, it's something we commonly struggle with, and it's something that can be understood given its proper context and realizing our role and our position in the grand scheme of things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and hidayah. Jazakallah khair al-jaza wa ma alayna illa al-balagh. Just two quick announcements. Commencing this week, inshallah, on Thursday is the annual Urus, Maulid and Jalsa of Hafiz Muhammad Ali Shah Khairabadi rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi and Kutbi Shahadakan as Khaja Habib Ali Shah rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. The theme for this year is the Aqsa Axis. And it commences on Thursday, where we will have our dhikr as usual after Isha Salah, and thereafter there will be salam and dua and refreshments. On Friday, inshallah, after Jumu'ah, there will be lunch, so everyone is invited for lunch. No need to make the dal gosh at home next week Friday. And after Isha, inshallah, will be the presentation. And the program will be on the Aqsa axis, after which the refreshments will be served. And thereafter, on Saturday, after Maghrib Salah, the program commences with Khatmi Khajigan, Julus Sandal, hoisting of the Qadri Chishti flag, Salam and Dua, supper, and then Mehfil Na'at will be held thereafter. Please spread the message, pass the message along, and bring your families along with the children and attend, inshallah. And then the other announcement is with regards to the timing for Eid Salah. And we'll know this evening, inshallah, based on the moon sighting, if Eid is Monday, which it's most likely to be, or otherwise on Tuesday. And the lecture will commence at 7:05 in the morning, and then Eid Salah will be held at 7:20. And that will be on Eid day, obviously, whether it's Monday or Tuesday. Jazakallah khair al-jazaa wa ma alayna illa al-balagh.